Today, we are plunging straight into California's increasingly volatile water reality. I mean, it's a place that's really being defined by environmental extremes. We're looking at a system that feels like it's teetering on the edge of failure, where survival, it seems, now hinges on this massive calculated gamble.
It really does. It's what a lot of us are calling the tale of two extremes. Climate change is just intensifying the already brutal cycles of California's weather. We're seeing deeper, more frequent droughts, that's the famine, and then bam, they're violently punctuated by these intensifying deluges.
The atmospheric rivers.
Exactly, these powerful atmospheric rivers that cause such widespread destruction. That's the feast. And this feast or famine cycle, it's forced the agricultural heartland to fundamentally rethink how they even survive.
And when the surface reservoirs run dry during those famine years, the dependency on groundwater it skyrockets. It often goes to completely unsustainable levels.
That's the critical point. In an average year, groundwater is absolutely essential. It supplies about 40% of the state's needs. But when a drought strikes, that dependency jumps. It jumps dramatically. Sometimes it's supplying up to 60% of the state's water.
Wow.
And the problem isn't temporary, it's chronic. California has been, for all intents and purposes, draining its underground water bank for decades.
Draining is definitely the right word.
Yeah.
Can you quantify that deficit for us? What does that actually look like?
Well, since 1962, we've chronically depleted approximately 81 million acre-feet of groundwater.
It's 81 million.
Yeah. And to put that into perspective for you, that's about 1.6 times the entire storage capacity of all the state's surface reservoirs combined.
That's staggering.
It is. That chronic overdraft has stressed this resource to its breaking point. It's threatening not just the massive agricultural economy, but also, the domestic water supply in countless rural communities, and even the physical stability of the land itself.
So, okay, we have this gigantic, urgent problem. How do you capture the feast water, these massive, destructive floodwaters, and then save it for the famine years? Because the traditional surface reservoirs, they're often already full or just totally overwhelmed during these huge deluge events.
Right, and here's where the solution lies, quite literally, right beneath our feet. It's in a technique called Managed Aquifer Recharge, or MR, and specifically something called FloodMAR, which, just as it sounds, intentionally uses those floodwaters to recharge our stressed aquifers.
And this is where the whole story really centers on one pioneering figure, someone who truly embodies the risk and the reward of this strategy.
That's Don Cameron of Terra Nova Ranch down in Fresno County. This guy risked his crops, his business, his entire livelihood by betting on this trickle-down survival tactic. He wasn't just trying to save his own farm. He was, in effect, proving a concept that could save America's agricultural heartland.
I have to admit, when I first read about this, the whole idea of intentionally flooding a high-value farm, it just sounded insane. But the science behind the potential is just massive. So our mission today is to unpack that journey and the implications of the storage potential. California's underground aquifers hold an estimated 850 million to 1.3 billion acre-feet of water.
It's a mind-boggling number.
It really is. That's roughly 10 times the entire volume of the state's surface reservoirs. So we need to figure out how Don Cameron and others are making FloodMAR work, what the huge logistical, geological, and policy hurdles are, and whether California can scale this solution fast enough to truly adapt to the climate whiplash we're already experiencing.
Okay, so let's unpack this dual crisis, starting with the climate itself. We talk a lot about climate change, but what exactly does climate whiplash look like on the ground in California? It sounds like we're not just talking about hotter and drier, but something fundamentally more chaotic. That's the crucial distinction.
Yeah.
We are seeing extreme variability that's outpacing all of our previous predictions. This manifests as these highly intense short-duration events, whether it's a theoretical 1,000-year storm or a Category 5 atmospheric river, an AR5, just hitting the state with massive amounts of moisture.
Right.
And critically, climate change isn't just about the overall volume of water. It's about the timing and the form of the precipitation. And this is what's fundamentally altering California's entire hydrology.
And you're talking about the Sierra Nevada snowpack, right? Which has historically been California's natural slow-release reservoir system.
Absolutely. The Sierra snowpack has, for centuries, held about 15 million acre-feet of water. And it acted as this perfect natural storage and delivery system. Snow is an insulator. It melts slowly throughout the late spring and summer, releasing water exactly when we need it.
But that's changing.
It's changing fast. Rising temperatures are converting mountain precipitation that would have fallen as that insulating snow into immediate heavy rain. This rain just rushes down the watersheds instantly. And our system, it's designed to handle a predictable spring melt, not a sudden, immediate winter deluge.
So in essence, the landscape has lost its natural ability to sort of meter out water during the dry season, which is right when it's needed most for agriculture and for cities.
That's exactly right. And that loss of the slow-release snowpack means immense pressure is immediately placed on our downstream flood management systems, on our reservoirs. They have to capture or release all that water right away, which increases the flood risk, particularly for the high-elevation San Joaquin watersheds. Those are predicted to see some of the largest percentage increases in flood volumes because of this rain-on-snow effect.
So it's a double whammy.
It is a double whammy. We lose the drought resilience that was provided by the snowpack, and we increase the flood risk because all that immediate rain is just overwhelming systems that were built for a gradual snowmelt.
And the flip side of that, the drought side, has been absolutely relentless in the Central Valley.
Devastating. I mean, just consider the core agricultural region of Fresno County. They endured 407 weeks of drought over the last decade, and 219 of those weeks were classified as exceptional drought, the most severe category you can have.
Wow.
When that happens, surface water allocations just dry up, the economic hardship becomes tangible, and the pressure on farmers to pump groundwater skyrockets, which of course just makes the overdraft problem even worse. It leads to job losses, fallowed fields, just a spiral of desperation.
And that desperation to pump, it has real human and physical consequences that go far beyond just low water levels. Let's talk for a second about the human toll, especially on disadvantaged communities, or DACs.
This is a profound equity issue. Overpumping of groundwater disproportionately impacts the shallow domestic wells used by many of these rural disadvantaged communities. They're the first wells to fail when the water table drops rapidly.
So the most vulnerable get hit first.
Always. A recent study projects that if this overpumping continues unchecked, over 9,200 domestic wells could fail by 2040. We hear these visceral stories from residents seeing their well pressure drop to critical levels, like, to 12 pounds of pressure only, which means their well is essentially failing. And these communities, which are already vulnerable, are left scrambling for something as basic as drinking water.
That is just an astonishing picture of social vulnerability intersecting with infrastructure failure. But the physical impacts extend even to the ground itself, right? Which results in subsidence, the land literally sinking.
Subsidence is the physical manifestation of chronic overdraft. It is the sinking or compaction of the land surface caused by the loss of hydrostatic pressure when you overpump water from these deep, confined aquifer systems. When the water leaves, the fine-grained clay layers just compress, and they do so permanently.
And Corcoran is the famous example.
Corcoran, California, in the Tulare Lake Basin, is famously the epicenter of this issue. It's sunk several feet in just recent decades.
So why is that sinking so critical for flood management, especially in a place like the Central Valley, which is already a giant floodplain?
Because when the land sinks, it permanently reduces the capacity of your flood conveyance systems, like canals and rivers. It compromises levees. It modifies floodplains. It dramatically increases the overall flood risk for everyone.
So the problem of managing groundwater is literally collapsing the very infrastructure that's meant to manage floods.
That's it. It makes the next big deluge even more catastrophic. The solution has to be integrated.
It's incredible to think that our inability to manage water is literally collapsing the ground we stand on. That level of crisis must have been the ultimate catalyst for policy. If this problem has been chronic since the 1960s, why did it take until 2014 for California to finally regulate groundwater pumping?
Well, before 2014, groundwater pumping operated largely outside the framework that regulated surface water use. It was often tied up in common law property rights, and there was a political reluctance to interfere with what many viewed as a property owner's right to their own water.
The classic California water fight.
Exactly. But the severity of the drought cycle, the documented well failures, and just the glaring physical evidence of subsidence, it finally pushed legislators to act. And that resulted in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, in 2014.
So SGMA was a political reckoning. What did it mandate?
SGMA was a monumental policy shift. It placed a regulatory mandate on local groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, to achieve what they call sustainability within a defined time frame. Essentially, they have to achieve a balance between pumping and recharge. You can't keep spending more than your annual water income.
A balanced budget for water.
A balanced budget for water.
Yeah.
The GSAs had to establish these long-term plans to reckon with the needs of all beneficial users: agriculture, cities, and the environment.
And that regulatory urgency is why MA and FloodMAR suddenly shifted from being kind of an academic concept to an urgent necessity.
Precisely. SGMA required action, and the response has been robust. GSAs have proposed over 1,500 local recharge projects. Altogether, they add up to 2.5 million acre-feet of annual recharge potential, but this comes with a projected capital cost of about $3 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, the scale of the transformation required to meet SGMA compliance is just immense, and MAR is really the only proven method to bank the necessary volume of water to close that overdraft gap.
So MA is the necessary response. Let's dig into the science here. What is managed aquifer recharge in its simplest form, and how does it, convey water through time?
So MA is just intentional human activity that's designed to rapidly increase the amount of water moving underground. It's really an engineering effort to bypass natural filtration bottlenecks and get water from the surface down through the soil and efficiently into the aquifer, where it can be stored for years and retrieved later.
So the goal is to maximize storage during the wet years for resilience in the dry years.
That's the whole game.
If we think of the aquifer as a giant underground sponge, MI is helping that sponge soak up water more efficiently and quickly, especially during those big flood events. What are the key engineering mechanisms we use to achieve this?
We can generally contrast three main methods, and they're based largely on the underlying geology. The first, and often the most cost-effective, are infiltration basins, or spreading basins. They are essentially just large surface ponds bounded by earthen berms. You use them to hold water and allow it to percolate naturally into the ground.
And which kind of geology favors these basins?
They work best for what we call unconfined aquifers. These are areas where the water table is the upper boundary and the water can filter down through the overlying unsaturated zone, the vadose zone. The capacity of these basins depends heavily on the size and, crucially, the permeability of the underlying sediments, how much clay versus sand or gravel is present.
But they have challenges.
Oh, significant challenges. They are prone to clogging, which slows the rate of percolation, and they risk something called water mounding.
Let's pause on that. What exactly is water mounding, and why is it a problem?
So, if you add water faster than the geology allows it to flow away laterally underground, if you have low hydraulic conductivity, the water table rises rapidly right under the basin. It creates a localized groundwater mound. And if that mound rises too high, it can cause some pretty undesirable outcomes like intersecting the basement of nearby houses or damaging subsurface utility lines or even mobilizing shallow, naturally occurring contaminants.
So it's a real balancing act between speed and the geological capacity.
Very delicate balancing act.
Okay, so if the geology prevents surface spreading, if you have, say, clay layers blocking the way, what's the second main technique?
That requires injection wells. These are essential for confined aquifers, which are aquifers that are bounded above and below by these low permeability layers, which prevent that surface percolation. The water in a confined aquifer is under pressure, so injection wells have to inject water directly into that target aquifer, also under pressure, to overcome the native hydrostatic head.
That sounds significantly more complex and costly than just digging a pond.
It is. Injection wells, they offer more flexibility in terms of the required land area and the ability to target deep, cleaner aquifers, but they are significantly more expensive to construct, operate, and maintain. And crucially, they require meticulous pretreatment of the source water to remove any suspended solids or gases or biological material, because clogging is an even bigger, more costly issue in a pressurized well bore than it is in an open basin.
And the third type, in-lieu recharge, seems less about physically pushing water underground and more about managing human behavior.
You hit the nail on the head. In-lieu recharge involves providing surface water to users, typically agricultural entities that need huge volumes, who would otherwise be forced to pump groundwater. So by meeting their irrigation demand with surface water, you are intentionally leaving the groundwater in place. You're achieving recharge by preventing extraction.
So it's a very cost-effective part of the modern sustainability plan.
Absolutely, because it avoids the infrastructure costs of physically putting water back in the ground.
What's fascinating here is that, while this all sounds like this cutting-edge crisis response, MIR is actually a long-established, proven global practice.
It is. It's not new. We have decades of successful applications proving that MI projects can solve diverse, complex water supply problems. For instance, in coastal areas all over the world, MIR is successfully used for saltwater intrusion mitigation.
How does that work in practice?
Well, saltwater is denser than freshwater. So when you overpump coastal wells, the saltwater interface moves inland and contaminates your freshwater supply. By injecting freshwater landward of the saline water, you increase the freshwater head, the pressure of the stored water, which acts as a hydraulic barrier, physically preventing that denser saltwater from moving inland.
That's a perfect application of using engineered storage to protect a valuable resource. What about using MIR to solve the actual physical damage caused by overdraft, like the subsidence we talked about in Corcoran?
The Wilmington oil field in Southern California provides a really important historical success story regarding subsidence control. The massive extraction of oil and gas from that field caused significant land sinkage. So starting in 1958, they began massive water injection into the oil zones to repressurize the underground structure.
And it worked.
It worked incredibly well. By 1969, the subsiding area had shrunk dramatically, and locally, the land surface had actually rebounded by as much as 1 foot. It demonstrated that MIR can be used not just to store water, but to mitigate and even partially reverse the physical damage caused by resource extraction.
That is powerful evidence. And what about adapting to specific seasonal demand swings?
The resort town of Wildwood, New Jersey provides a great example of using MIR for solving seasonal demand. Wildwood is on a barrier island, and its population just explodes with tourists in the summer. So since 1967, they've used something called Aquifer Storage and Recovery, or ASR, to inject treated water into slightly saline aquifers beneath the island during the quiet off-peak season.
And that creates a bubble of fresh water.
It creates a lens of good quality fresh water that they can then recover during the summer peak. It's a brilliant strategy because it allowed them to avoid the prohibitively high costs of building massive inland treatment and transmission facilities that would just be underutilized for 9 months of the year.
So it's a proven technology for managing volume, pressure, and seasonal fluctuations. Beyond just volume, can MIR actually improve the quality of the water that's already underground?
It absolutely can, primarily through dilution. If you inject cleaner source water into a brackish or slightly contaminated aquifer, you can lower the overall concentration of contaminants below drinking water standards, making the native water usable again.
So you're basically using the clean water to, I guess, wash the aquifer.
Exactly. Let's take chloride, which has a secondary maximum contaminant level, an MCL, of 250 milligrams per liter. Imagine you have native groundwater that's slightly brackish at, say, 400 milligl. And you inject fresh river water that's only 50 milligl. By blending those two sources underground, you can easily meet the 250 milligl standard. The beauty of MIR is that you can actually create more total usable water volume than the volume of fresh water you injected just by rendering the previously unusable native water fit for consumption through dilution.
So you increase the overall usable supply without ever having to move that vast quantity of native water to a surface treatment plant.
You got it.
And that brings us back to California and the necessity of flood-MAR, where we deliberately marry flood control with aquifer recharge, often using private agricultural land. It's an integration that turns a destructive, chaotic force of flood into a critical, storable resource.
It's a total paradigm shift. I mean, historically, irrigation districts maintain their own dedicated recharge basins. For instance, the Madera Irrigation District, MID, they traditionally had basins that held about 8,000 acre-feet of capacity. But the scale of the overdraft problem, driven by SGMA, demanded a much larger solution, so they looked to partner with the largest landowners around, the growers.
And that partnership has been revolutionary in terms of capacity.
Completely transformative. By 2019, MID had partnered with growers and was able to nearly double its recharge capacity, adding an extra 10,700 acre-feet through these on-farm projects. And this strategy became absolutely critical during the extreme deluge of 2023. We had a record 31 atmospheric rivers between October and March that year.
Unbelievable.
It was. And that year, Tulare Irrigation District, one of the early adopters of this approach, they diverted a record-breaking 414,000 acre-feet of surface water directly into winter irrigation applications for recharge. That is an immense volume of water banked. It's the equivalent of a major reservoir stored without having to build a single new dam.
And this is where we really have to focus on Don Cameron of Terra Nova Ranch. He is the face of this revolution, driven by the urgency of SGMA and the chronic water depletion crisis. His risk was immense, and his success provided the necessary proof of concept. So what exactly did his experiment entail, and why did everyone think it might destroy his farm?
The Tenebra essentially went all in on this trickle-down survival tactic. He took uncontrolled floodwaters, the very water that flood managers were desperate to get rid of and that most farmers see as an existential threat. And he intentionally flooded his high-value perennial crops. specifically his vineyards and his tree nut orchards, like almonds and pistachios.
In a perennial crop, unlike an annual crop like cotton, that's a massive long-term investment. You plant it once, it produces for decades. If you kill the root system, you lose years of revenue, the capital cost of the trees, the years of labor, everything.
Precisely. Flooding perennial crops, especially during the non-growing season, carries the very real risk of asphyxiating the roots, which leads to massive financial loss. Farmers operate on these tight margins, and losing an orchard can be a multi-million-dollar devastation that takes a decade or more to recover from. But Don Cameron, he was proactive. He recognized that if he didn't solve the groundwater problem, his farm wouldn't survive anyway. And he and the researchers who partnered with him, they didn't have much prior data on flooding growing crops for recharge purposes.
So he essentially ran a massive, real-world experiment on his own dime. What was the immediate result that proved the risk paid off?
The risk absolutely paid off. The crops, which were dormant during that winter flood period, they survived the temporary inundation. The viability was proven, and his farm quickly became this critical example. It was functioning as flood relief infrastructure that also provides groundwater recharge as a massive beneficial side effect.
A win-win.
A total win-win. And his success provided researchers and other growers with the critical knowledge needed to develop best practices. Specifically, determining the safe duration and depth of inundation for specific crop types during their dormant season. This single example shifted the entire conversation from, can we do this, to, okay, how fast can we scale this?
That success story provided the blueprint for institutional transformation. So how is California trying to duplicate Don Cameron's success and make this collaborative approach the norm?
Through the powerful mechanism of the network effect, the Flood Mare Network was formed specifically to foster collaboration across what were traditionally separate and often adversarial disciplines. You're talking about farmers, civil engineers, academic researchers, regulatory water agencies, all in the same room.
Finally talking to each other.
Finally talking. And the network's core insight is really profound. The soft stuff is the hard stuff, meaning that the social and institutional transformation, building trust, and building shared knowledge is actually the most difficult barrier to scaling this technology.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, the technical hurdles can be solved with science, but getting disparate groups to agree on the flow of water and money, that requires consensus and trust.
Absolutely. And the network acts as essential infrastructure for knowledge and governance. They facilitate activities like lunch mayar webinars, they form action teams to tackle specific policy barriers, and they help regional groups pool resources and knowledge on topics like water quality or crop tolerance. Since the network began its formal operations, it has mobilized into this powerful community of practice that now boasts 430 participating members.
Wow.
The consensus from the ground is clear. Persistence in building trust is how you make these policies implementable at scale. It's this ongoing process of aligning different stakeholders under a shared existential threat.
So Don Cameron proved the concept, but scaling it up from one farm to the entire Central Valley floor, that introduces immense, highly localized complexity. Let's tackle the technical hurdles, starting with the fundamental constraint, geology.
Geology is absolutely the ultimate gatekeeper. Not all land is created equal for recharge. Successful MAR depends entirely on the subsurface properties, specifically the hydraulic conductivity.
Which is basically just how easily water can move through the rock or soil, right?
Exactly. That and the depth to the water table. If you're trying to recharge over a thick layer of compacted clay, the water simply won't reach the aquifer efficiently, and the project will be ineffective.
So how do modern scientists and water managers figure out where the best underground spots are without constantly drilling test wells?
They rely on advanced, non-invasive mapping and modeling tools. The Department of Water Resources, DWR, has been conducting extensive characterization of subsurface geology in the high and medium priority groundwater basins. They use techniques like airborne electromagnetic surveys, or AEM.
AEM.
Yeah, think of it as a giant sophisticated metal detector or an ultrasound for the Earth, and it's often towed beneath a helicopter. They also use ground-based instruments like towed transient electromagnetic surveys or towed TEM.
That's fascinating. How does the AEM survey work?
Well, by using electromagnetic signals, these instruments can map variations in electrical conductivity underground. Since clay and silt are electrically conductive and sands and gravels are resistive, these surveys can create a 3D picture of the subsurface structure. They identify where the high permeability sand and gravel channels exist, the optimal pathways for water to rapidly move down to the aquifer.
So it lets managers find the best, most efficient recharge locations and avoid costly mistakes.
You got it.
And if they choose a spot that, despite the mapping, has low hydraulic conductivity, but they pour floodwater in too fast, that brings us right back to the mounding challenge.
Exactly. The mounding challenge is a major constraint in surface-based recharge. If the water is added to an unconfined aquifer faster than it can flow away laterally, the water table rises rapidly, creating that localized groundwater mound. If this mounding is excessive, it causes serious problems. It can damage existing subsurface infrastructure like septic systems or pipelines, it can cause localized basement flooding, and it can even reduce the effectiveness of the recharge operation itself.
So you need predictive models.
Highly accurate predictive groundwater flow models are critical. They estimate the future hydraulic responses and mounding potential before construction ever begins.
Okay, let's look at the next major complication. Crop and land use compatibility. Don Cameron's farm proved it was possible, but for the rest of the Central Valley, what are the specific knowledge gaps?
The knowledge gaps are significant and highly localized. Growers need data to confidently determine if their specific crops, almonds, pistachios, various grape varieties, can tolerate temporary seasonal inundation. And what are the precise threshold amounts for applied water? Is it safe to flood for 2 weeks, 1 month? Does the soil temperature matter? These answers vary by crop, soil type, location.
A lot of variables.
A ton. Growers need to weigh the huge long-term benefit of water security against the immediate financial risk of damaging years of investment.
And they often need new infrastructure just to participate, right?
That's a key barrier. Conveyance. Many critically overdrafted basins just don't have sufficient surface water conveyance infrastructure to move massive volumes of floodwater from the river channels onto remote farms. So to solve this, some farmers are evaluating or installing dual drip and flood irrigation systems.
Oh, that's clever.
It is. This innovation allows them the flexibility to flood their land for recharge during the wet, non-irrigation season, while still relying on efficient drip irrigation when water is scarce. And tools like the Groundwater Recharge Assessment Tool, or GRAT, help managers determine the where and when based on soil, aquifer, and land use characteristics.
Here's where the conversation requires careful attention. The hidden danger of water quality geochemistry. When you introduce new water underground, you can trigger reactions that create new risks. What are the two main water quality dangers in MR projects?
The two major risks are contaminant introduction and contaminant mobilization, and both are linked directly to the chemical properties of the source water and the existing aquifer.
Let's start with introduction. What new contaminants are we worried about?
If ERA projects use alternative, non-traditional sources like treated wastewater effluent, they run the risk of introducing emerging contaminants if the treatment isn't sufficient. These are substances we are only now starting to fully understand, like residual pharmaceuticals, hormones, microplastics, or even antibiotic-resistant bacteria and viruses.
So you need comprehensive pretreatment.
And extensive monitoring. Both are essential to ensure public health safety.
And the second risk, mobilization, is perhaps more challenging because it involves pollutants that were already there, just dormant, locked up in the soil matrix.
That's the more insidious risk, for sure. Contaminant mobilization occurs when introducing new water triggers a change in that aquifer's internal chemistry. It essentially acts like a solvent to release metals that are trapped in the soil. The key chemical lever here is the oxidation reduction potential, or redox.
Can you explain redox simply for the listener?
Sure. Think of redox as the availability of oxygen in the water. An aquifer that is reducing has little to no oxygen. It's anaerobic. An aquifer that is oxidizing is rich in oxygen. The stability of toxic metals like arsenic or iron is entirely dependent on this oxygen level. When you inject oxygen-rich floodwater into an aquifer that has historically been low oxygen, you change the chemistry. And that acts like a trigger, dissolving metals that were previously harmlessly bound to the sediment.
Give us the key examples of those dangerous chemical shifts.
Okay, we have several critical examples. First, iron, Fa, and manganese. These metals often increase in mobility when the environment shifts to reducing low oxygen conditions. Injecting source water that depletes the existing oxygen can cause these naturally occurring minerals to dissolve into the groundwater, making it unsafe for drinking. Second, arsenic, AS, and uranium. This is a critical concern, particularly in high-risk agricultural areas like the Tulare Lake basin. Arsenic mobility tends to increase dramatically when the water becomes high pH or oxidizing. So if the injected floodwater alters the native groundwater chemistry, it can mobilize the arsenic already present in the aquifer matrix, leading to severe health hazards.
So depending on the geology and the specific chemistry of the contaminant already in place, you could inadvertently turn safe drinking water toxic simply by adding new incompatible water. This requires meticulous geochemical characterization before a project even starts.
Absolutely. Geochemical compatibility is non-negotiable to minimize adverse reactions. It's why regulatory agencies require extensive characterization of both the source water and the receiving aquifer. And beyond that, we see major policy efforts focus on nitrogen management because fertilizer application is the main source of nitrate in shallow groundwater, which is a massive health concern in areas like the Tulare Lake Basin and the Salinas Valley.
And finally, we have the primary technical headache that affects the long-term viability of the physical infrastructure itself: clogging.
Clogging is the primary operational sustainability challenge facing all MAR projects, whether they use basins or wells. It dramatically reduces recharge rates and increases maintenance costs. And clogging of well screens and infiltration basin surfaces, it can happen rapidly due to three main causes.
Which are?
First, physical clogging from suspended sediments in the source water. Second, mechanical clogging from the entrainment of air or gas during the injection process. And third, biogeochemical clogging, which are reactions that lead to the buildup of biological material like bacterial slime or chemical precipitates.
The sources include some pretty striking visual evidence of this issue, showing how rapidly injection wells can degrade.
They really show the urgency. We have images showing well screens going from perfectly clean to significantly clogged in a sequence from just 1 day to 73 days. This rapid reduction in performance means that operation and maintenance costs are a constant consideration. Preventing this requires diligent pretreatment of the source water, for example, removing suspended solids through filtration, and specialized maintenance techniques like aggressive backwashing or chemical treatment to sustain long-term performance.
The technical challenges are daunting, but the political and financial challenges associated with scaling up flood form might be even harder. Let's start with integration. Flood control and groundwater management were traditionally separate universes, right? They were operating in silos. How is climate change forcing them to integrate?
The integration is driven by sheer necessity. Climate change modeling predicts that peak flows and high scenario events for the Central Valley will increase by up to 5 times. This drastically increases the vulnerability of our current reservoirs, which were just not designed for these extremes.
So our infrastructure is out of date.
Massively. The Merced River watershed study, for example, estimated that in an extreme modeled climate condition, reservoir releases could be 600% higher than the downstream channel capacity, forcing emergency destructive flood operations.
That is a recipe for catastrophic failure. How do we prevent that, and how does MAR play into it?
The answer lies in combining advanced weather prediction with MAR. This leads to the FIRO-MAR concept. FIRO stands for Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations. This concept uses modern weather and inflow forecasting, specifically sophisticated atmospheric river monitoring, to create pre-release flood space in reservoirs.
So instead of waiting till the last minute and making these emergency damaging releases, you use better forecasting to intentionally release non-damaging flood control water ahead of the storm.
You've got it. And in the FIRO-MAR concept, that pre-release water isn't just wasted down the drain, it's directed for a recharge.
So it's directed downstream for immediate managed aquifer recharge.
Exactly. This ensures a multi-benefit outcome. Studies, like that Merced River watershed study, show that Level 2 flood MAR strategies, those combining reservoir reoperation like FIRO and MAR, significantly reduce flood risk compared to traditional static reservoir operations. This integrated approach allows managers to reduce flood vulnerability and simultaneously improve water supply reliability by banking that water underground.
If we know this works, the next logical question is money.
Yeah.
We are talking about transforming the water management system of the entire state. What is the scale of the financial need?
The scale is absolutely massive. The recommended investment for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the CVFPP, over the next 30 years is estimated to be between $25 and $30 billion.
Billion with a B.
With a B. And unfortunately, funding has been inconsistent and is currently lagging significantly behind target levels. Since 2017, only about $4.3 billion of the previously recommended amounts has actually been appropriated. The urgency of climate adaptation is really outpacing our financial commitment.
That is a staggering gap.
Yeah.
How does California plan to bridge that gap when dedicated funding sources, like state general obligation bonds, are often subject to so much political volatility?
The key strategy is relying on multi-benefit projects, or MBPs. FloodMAR, by its nature, is an ideal MBP. It provides flood reduction, water supply through recharge, and often habitat or ecosystem enhancement. By defining a project as having multiple benefits, local agencies can access and leverage multiple funding streams, making it a much higher value investment that justifies shared costs across different sectors.
And this ability to account for the recharged water is crucial for financing.
It is, especially in rural areas where local customer bases are smaller and just can't bear the full burden.
Are there new federal opportunities helping this cause?
Yes, there are. The FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, or BRIC, is a major new federal opportunity. It strongly encourages nature-based solutions and climate change consideration. The BRIC budget has dramatically increased, reaching $900 million nationally.
But there's a catch.
There's a big catch. We have a significant capacity issue. Local agencies, especially smaller, rural, and disadvantaged communities, they often lack the institutional capacity, the technical staff, and the resources needed to assemble the highly complex, competitive applications required to secure this federal funding. We really need to invest in local capacity to capture those vital federal dollars.
And beyond the money, the bureaucratic hurdles surrounding water rights are legendary in California. They often require years of analysis. This has to be a critical barrier, especially if we need to divert flood flows immediately.
That's right. Getting a standard water right permit requires this extensive analysis and a finding that there is unappropriated water available to supply the applicant. It requires a full environmental review under CEQA and public interest findings. But policymakers have recognized that for flood capture, which is an environmental good, this process needs to be expedited.
And what specific policy advancement has directly addressed this bottleneck?
Well, the State Water Board has already developed streamlined permitting processes for groundwater recharge. But the most crucial legislative leap came in 2023 with California Water Code Section 142.1. This law is transformative. It allows local agencies to divert flood flows for groundwater recharge without a full, lengthy water right permit under specific emergency conditions, provided they meet certain requirements like adopting a local flood control plan.
That is a giant step toward recognizing the urgency of the problem. It essentially recognizes that during a high-flow flood event, that water is available for diversion and shouldn't be held up by months or years of paperwork.
It creates a pathway for immediate action, which is vital when you consider how rapidly these high-flow events occur under climate whiplash. The CVFPP framework strongly stresses the need for continued investment in these governance structures. And the Flood Mayor Network, now an essential infrastructure of collaboration, is critical to building the institutional and social trust required to align all these complex policies, technologies, and financial strategies across all sectors. The ultimate success, it depends on this continued commitment across all levels of government and, most importantly, on the ground with the farmers who are willing to take that initial risk.
We started this deep dive with the tale of two extremes, the waves of drought and deluge defining California's water future. And the necessity of fighting that dual threat isn't building bigger dams, but rather merging the traditionally separate worlds of flood control and groundwater management.
And that transformation has really been powered by pioneering figures like Don Cameron, who took a significant existential personal risk. He bet his farm on a concept that could save the industry. His success and the resulting creation of the Flood Mayor Network and new policies like Water Code 1242.1, they show that the path to resilience is set by SGMA, and it's being catalyzed by climate urgency.
This is no longer just about technical feasibility. I mean, the data shows Flood Mayor works. But scaling it up to meet that multi-billion-dollar investment need, it requires massive, sustained, collaborative action. From scientists using AEM surveys to map the subsurface, to farmers installing innovative dual irrigation systems, to policymakers creating stable funding structures and simplifying those permits. This is a profound, multi-generational commitment to adapting to chaos.
And if we look at the raw storage capacity of the state, it's incredible. The surface reservoirs hold about 50 million acre-feet of water, whereas the underground aquifers, they hold between 850 million and 1.3 billion acre-feet. As climate change makes surface storage less predictable, less reliable, and more vulnerable to shifting precipitation patterns, this raises a crucial, provocative thought for all Californians.
Given that capacity is so vast, we're talking 10 to 20 times greater than our surface storage. Should society reframe its entire water infrastructure strategy? Should we prioritize the aquifer not merely as an emergency buffer for drought, but as the primary long-term water storage solution for California's future? The capacity is there. The necessity certainly is. The question remaining is, do we have the sustained will and the political urgency to build an entire economy on water stored underground?